Ladies and gentlemen, let's Gaming video. Let us discuss recent news of the Xbox One's version of Tomb Raider Definitive Edition running significantly lower frame rate than the PlayStation 4's, plus in addition to that, an industry insider has also been commenting that we're going to be seeing a far inferior version of Watch Dogs on the Xbox One compared to the PS4 and PC. So I have done this as an article, and as normal, as you would expect, I've put the relevant links in to the statements from various sources, and I've also given you guys the maths or the breakdowns on how things work. So if you so wish to follow up and learn more, you can by all means do just that. So anyway, I'm sure you're aware that it was confirmed that Tomb Raider Definitive Edition on both the PS4 and Xbox One is going to include such features as Tress FX. It's going to be running at 1080p, and of course we're going to be seeing better graphics compared to the previous generation of consoles. It was, however, a little bit more silent from the developers in terms of the frame rate. And in a recent interview, the developers stated that the title is going to be running at least 30 frames per second with an unlocked frame rate, so the game can basically run as fast as possible. In other words, just to clarify what this means, if the GPU/system isn't being overly taxed in a particular area of the game, the frame rate can go higher because it doesn't have so much to do, compared to locked, where even if it's got spare rendering, it won't draw any more than that. So you get a consistent frame rate. There's pros and cons to both. Anyway, what basically happened was that a website known as Rocket Chainsaw, I've given all these as links, by the way, inside the article as I mentioned, managed to get hold of some sources, and they stated that the PS4 version of Tomb Raider is running at 60 frames per second. Meanwhile, the Xbox One version is running at just 30 frames per second. Now, before we go any further, let's clarify that the differences in terms of graphics and resolutions is none. They said maybe there's a tiny little bit of difference graphically, but it's basically identical. So, in short, if you were to just look at a static screenshot, if this is true, you would not be able to say, okay, well, this is blatantly the PS4 version, or this is blatantly the Xbox One version. So the difference is purely frame rate. The Xbox One version does manage to hit around 45 frames per second when there's not that much going on screen. So let's leave Tomb Raider in the back burner for a moment, and now let's focus our attention to Watch Dogs. Watch Dogs, of course, is being released on pretty much all of the next generation consoles, including the Wii U, as well as the PC. And Ashan Rasheed, also known as Thuway on Twitter, gave numerous comments. He basically stated PC, then PS4, then Xbox One, then Wii U. And then, afterwards, he said, "Oh, I'm not surprised further PS4 optimizations in years 3 or 4 will widen the delta of performance gap, and then I didn't think the performance differences would be this large so early, but the jury's still out." He also commented a little bit regarding his thoughts and opinions on the whole machinima debacle, which I'm sure you're aware of, and I've included links to that in the article, but I won't touch on it for the purpose of this because I want to keep this video fairly focused. So the basic issue here, of course, it certainly isn't limited to this. I'm sure you all remember Assassin's Creed 4 Black Flag, which was fairly infamous in that it had a lower resolution on the X1 compared to the PS4, although the PS4 version did require a patch to run at 1080p. I just want to clarify that. Meanwhile, BF4 and Call of Duty Ghosts ran worse on the Xbox One. Primarily resolution. I would like to further clarify even more that there were issues on frame rate with the PS4 version as well. Some of those were somewhat resolved on patches as far as my understanding goes, but I'm assuming it's primarily due to the higher internal rendered resolution of Battlefield 4. But suffice to say, yeah. So the Xbox One version definitely suffered from that. And so now there's a lot of arguments being reignited. I mean, I think like console war arguments, and you know, I don't like to say console war because it sounds really what's the word? Playgroundy. Okay, that's not really a word, but whatever. It sounds really childish, but the bottom line is people, you know, if they've got this console that they support, or they've got an opinion, generally speaking, they're going to look for any reason to reignite it. So there are, of course, numerous theories as to why we're seeing such massive discrepancies on the Xbox One versus PS4. Now, before we discuss this any further, let's instead turn our attentions to the resolution argument, not the frame rate argument, the resolution argument. How much of a difference it makes. There's a lot of people who say 900p versus 1080p. Who cares? You know, on the other hand, you could argue that it really depends heavily on the size of your television. Now, I've spoken about this heavily on RGT previously, but 1600 by 900, which by the way is 900p, is 1.44 million pixels compared to 2.07 million of 1080p. So in effect, right there, it's a huge amount of extra pixels. There's a huge amount of extra detail that goes by at 900p. Obviously, if you're running at like a 20-inch screen and you're a fair distance away, you're not going to notice it. If you're running a 50-inch screen, however, and you're fairly close, especially if it's a really, you know, good make and a good high-end television, you're most likely going to notice it, especially if you've got good eyesight. But just how much, your mileage may vary. Frame rate, well, it really depends on your perspective. Obviously, on a game like Tomb Raider, it's less of a big deal because a slight latency, like, for example, a 3 or a 4 and 8 millisecond latency on like a game like Tomb Raider isn't a huge big deal. On the other hand, first-person shooters and, let's say, a fighting game, that's going to be a big issue. So clearly, in this case, Square felt comfortable to say that resolution-wise, we're cool at 1080p. Instead, you know, let's just make sure the game runs at 30 minimum, and as far as what we understand, it does. So minimum we should be seeing is 30 to 45 frames a second. It's going to be bouncing around that, of course. So what does that mean for Microsoft? Well, ironically, it's probably actually worse for them in terms of PR than what it was for anything else. Because right now, I'm sure you're aware of the advertising fiasco. That's obviously hurting them in terms of positive PR. And now, of course, you're getting this battering them again. It's really just reminding people about these deficiencies in terms of the performance. And that's likely going to be hurting Microsoft significantly worse, which, in my opinion, is a huge shame. Because, obviously, if you're talking about the lineup, if you're talking about the games, if you're talking about the titles, that's where the machine can really shine. But it just seems right now Microsoft, some of it definitely their own fault, and some of it not so much their fault, and they really just don't seem to be able to catch much of a break right now, which is making things really sad considering the system is that much more expensive. To get back to another small point before I leave you guys, it's already being argued to death because, admittedly, Thuway mentioned the gap's going to widen. So here's what basically people originally thought. The basic premise was, let's say that you've got a system that outputs 100, right? So let's just say raw percentages. Let's not talk about G-flops. Let's not talk about clock cycle. Let's not talk about shaders. Let's just talk about percentages. The basic theory was that both machines should be able to be tweaked roughly the same amount. In fact, some people expected the Xbox One's tweaking to go further than the PS4's. So let's say, for example, pure arbitrary figures. I'm not saying this was the numbers, but let's just use pure arbitrary figures and say that the Xbox One could be tweaked 125%. So in other words, it's been tweaked, they understand the architecture better, they've got better API, the drivers have been improved overall, the operating system has been improved in terms of maybe taking less memory. So we're just going to give an overall improvement of tweaking, and obviously I'm vastly simplifying this for the purposes of time, but let's just say you can get 125%. The basic theory was that the PS4 would be about the same, like 125% for its relative performance, maybe 120. However, if these comments are true, it seems that there's actually more lift in the PS4's tank than what there is in the Xbox One's. Now, I'm not claiming to have any insider information regarding this, and so I'm hoping that this isn't true. Because if it is, it means the gap between the PS4 and the Xbox One is definitely going to increase. The only thing I can think of offhand, and the reason that maybe that this could be true, and I'm not saying it is, I'd like to highlight that, but the one reason I can maybe possibly think it is that maybe Sony knows, maybe there is something in the drivers, for example, where it was similar to the Xbox One drivers, where they can improve the performance of the GPU. Maybe Sony haven't done those levels of tweaks yet. Or maybe it's something completely more down to the game's developers. Maybe it's something along the lines of the fact that they'll learn compute, and obviously the PS4's compute structure, just on the face of it, is more powerful. It has more ACE engines, more asynchronous compute engines, and can hold more queues for those engines as well, which means you get much better compute performance. And since the CPU of both of these consoles is pretty much weak compared to a desktop PC, and that's not just me saying that, that's true. You can Google it if you don't believe me, but it's been proven through texture generation benchmarks that the PS4's and the Xbox One's CPU is comparatively weak compared to a desktop PC. So a lot of this really is going to come down to compute. So that could be another possibility. Of course, the final option that I can personally think of, and this is once again just pure idle thought process on my part, but the only other option that I can personally think of is that the OS maybe of the PS4 has more room to be shrunk down. Maybe the memory reserve would be easier to increase on the PS4 because maybe the operating system doesn't take quite so much memory, and therefore, of course, extra memory is definitely going to improve the development times and the performance of games, because let's face it, even 512 megabytes can definitely make the difference. Right, sometimes just 20 megabytes, if you don't have enough memory and you only need 2K extra to fit an object in, but you don't have that 2K of memory, I'm going to tell you, if someone said, hey, would you like us to give you 2K extra, you're going to want that 2K. And while you may think I'm being silly, on the previous generation of consoles, for example, the PS3 and Xbox 360, it's been stated numerous times that in some cases, they were just out by little tiny hairs, like just a couple of KB. In some cases, they just had to shave and alter things just to get them into the memory. So they might have to slightly compress a texture here, or maybe tweak a sound effect there and lower the bitrate, or whatever they needed to do to make sure that everything fit. And obviously, if they do have a little bit more memory on the PS4, that's going to be a thing. But as I said, I just want to clarify that isn't something Thuway said, but he has said the gap is going to widen. So I guess we're just going to have to see if there's further clarification on that. Meanwhile, If you would like to join me, my friends, we have lots of room in the RGT nuclear fallout bunker while we wait for this next nuclear explosion of rage to begin to sweep across the internet. And I'm going to see you soon, hopefully, anyway. Well, yeah, assuming the internet hasn't blew itself apart by then, I'll see you soon. Take care. Bye for now.